The cold seeped through the thin fabric of her shirt, a damp, greasy chill that had nothing to do with the November air. It was the cold of fear. It lived in the alley, a permanent resident of the space between overflowing dumpsters and the slick, grimy brick of the restaurant's back wall. Layla's breath hitched, a small, white cloud swallowed by the darkness. His shadow fell over her, a monolith of stale beer and cheap cologne, eclipsing the single, buzzing security light. Marcus. The name was a scar on her tongue. His fingers dug into her upper arm, the grip a familiar vice. "Thought you could just disappear?" he sneered, his voice a gravelly thing that scraped at her nerves. "Thought you were too good for me now." His face was too close, the pores on his nose a constellation of malice. She could see the burst blood vessel in his left eye, a tiny crimson lightning bolt. She pressed herself back against the wall, the rough brick biting into her spine. "Marcus, please. Just leave me alone." Her voice was a thread, thin and frayed. She was so tired of being strong, of fighting. All she wanted was to get back to the tiny apartment, to check on her mother, to pretend for a few hours that the world wasn't a place of sharp edges and grabbing hands. "Leave you alone?" He laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "After everything I did for you? I own you, Layla." He shoved her hard. Her head connected with the wall, and the world flared with a nauseating white light. Pain bloomed at the back of her skull, hot and immediate. She tasted copper. He grabbed the collar of her white shirt, the one she kept pristine for job interviews that never went anywhere, and twisted. A button popped, skittering into the filth on the ground. "You're nothing without me," he spat, his face contorted with a possessive rage that was more terrifying than any physical blow. "Nothing." He raised his hand, and she flinched, a Pavlovian response she hated more than the man himself. The blow never landed. The world inside was a universe away. Gilded ceilings, the hushed clink of silver on porcelain, the low murmur of conversations that cost more per minute than Layla earned in a week. From his secluded booth, Minjun saw everything. He had designed it that way. The restaurant, Jan, was his, a legitimate front for an empire built on shadows and blood, a quiet place to conduct business where the sauces were as complex as the contracts. He wasn't watching the dining room. His gaze was fixed on the bank of security monitors discreetly built into the wall beside his table, cycling through the exterior cameras. He saw the alley. He saw the man, a brute whose name he neither knew nor cared about. And he saw her. Layla. The name was a ghost on his lips, unspoken. The years fell away, and he was back in a crowded university library, watching her chew on the end of her pen, her brow furrowed in concentration. The memory was an unwelcome warmth in the icy control of his world. He watched the man shove her, saw her head snap back against the brick. Something inside him, a long-dormant and dangerous thing, awoke. The wine in his glass, a vintage older than she was, suddenly tasted like ash. He saw the man twist her shirt, saw her flinch. His jaw tightened, a muscle ticking violently. His associate, Jay, stood a respectful distance away, a silent statue in a perfectly tailored suit. Minjun didn't look at him. His eyes remained locked on the monitor, on the raised hand poised to strike her again. His voice, when he spoke, was unnervingly calm, a quiet note of death in the symphony of the restaurant. "The alley," he said, his voice a low vibration. "Bring her to me." Jay nodded once, a sharp, economical movement. He touched his earpiece and murmured something in Korean. Two other men, seated at the bar, rose without a word and moved toward the service exit. The intervention was swift, silent, and brutal. One moment, Marcus was a king in his squalid kingdom of filth and fear. The next, he was a puppet with his strings cut, lifted from his feet by two ghosts who appeared from the shadows. There was a single, muffled sound, a wet crack of bone breaking. Layla saw Marcus crumble, his eyes wide with shock before they glazed over. She was left staring at two men in dark suits, their faces impassive, their presence more terrifying than the violence they had just stopped. One of them looked at her, his gaze holding no warmth, no pity. "Chairman Kim will see you now." She was propelled forward, not by a rough shove, but by an unnerving, implacable pressure. Her legs moved, but She wasn't sure she was the one controlling them. They walked her through a service corridor that smelled of bleach and roasting garlic, then through a heavy door and into the heart of the beast. The sudden warmth and light were a shock to her system. Her eyes, accustomed to the alley's gloom, watered. She was a discordant note in this place of quiet opulence, her rumpled clothes a disgrace, the bruise already blooming on her cheek of vulgarity. Diners glanced over, their curiosity veiled but sharp, before quickly looking away. No one challenged the men flanking her. No one dared. They led her to a booth in the back, secluded and private, where a man sat alone. He was watching her approach, his face a mask of cold neutrality. Mignon. Older, harder, the boyish charm she remembered from college calcified into something dangerous and unreadable. He wore a suit that was a shade of black the night sky envied, tailored so perfectly it seemed fused to his skin. He looked from her torn collar to the swelling on her cheek, and for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something raw and violent crossed his features before being suppressed. He dismissed his men with a barely perceptible nod. They vanished. Layla stood before his table, trembling, caught between the lingering terror of the alley and the new, unknown threat of him. "Sit," he said. It wasn't a request. She sat, her movements stiff. Her hands were clenched in her lap, knuckles white. He pushed a glass of water toward her. His own hands were clean, nails impeccably manicured. She remembered those hands sketching equations in a notebook, and the cognitive dissonance made her feel dizzy. "What do you want, Minjun?" she asked, her voice raspy. He ignored the question. "He will not touch you again." It was a statement of fact, absolute and final. The certainty of it was more frightening than any threat. "I don't need your help." The lie tasted like sawdust in her mouth. She was drowning, and she knew it. The medical bills for her mother were a mountain of paper on their small kitchen table, each one a landslide threatening to bury them. "You are mistaken," he replied, his tone even. "You do." He leaned forward slightly, the scent of expensive cologne and cold power drifting across the table. "You will live in a property I own. Your mother will have the best medical care. You will finish your degree. In return, you will be safe." It was an offer of a gilded cage. Her pride, the last thing she truly owned, screamed at her to refuse, to walk out and face the wolves on her own. But then she thought of her mother, Amina, whose breath had become a shallow, rattling thing in the past few weeks. She thought of the eviction notice tucked under her pillow. Safety. The word was a foreign country she'd only ever dreamed of visiting. "Why?" she whispered. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a crack in the marble facade. She saw the ghost of the boy who had once smiled at her over a textbook. "Because I should have done this a long time ago." The apartment was on the 32nd floor of a sterile glass tower that scraped the clouds. It was beautiful and empty, a place with a view, but no soul. It had 3 bedrooms, a kitchen with appliances that hummed with quiet efficiency, and windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, revealing a sprawling, indifferent city below. It was also a prison. There were men in the lobby, men in the hallway, their presence a constant, silent reminder of her new reality. Minjun had been true to his word. The day after the incident at the restaurant, a private ambulance had arrived at their crumbling walk-up, staffed by a doctor who spoke to her mother with a gentle deference that made Layla's throat ache. Amina was moved into one of the pristine bedrooms, into a state-of-the-art hospital bed that looked alien against the minimalist decor. A full-time nurse was hired. Specialists were consulted. Prescriptions were filled. The mountain of bills vanished. Layla was left to wander the silent, echoing space, a ghost in her own life. For the first week, she checked the locks every hour. The heavy thud of the deadbolt was a small, satisfying sound in the oppressive quiet. She'd press her ear to the door, listening for footsteps that weren't the steady, predictable patrol of Minjun's guards. She expected him to appear, to demand something, payment, but he didn't. He was an absence, a force she could feel but not see. Groceries appeared in the refrigerator. A credit card with her name on it was delivered by a silent man in a suit. Her tuition for the semester was paid in full. He never called. He never visited. Then one Tuesday, he was simply there. She walked into her mother's room and found him sitting in a chair by the window, not looking at the view, but at Amina. Her mother, propped up on her pillows, was awake and lucid for the first time in days. She was talking to him, her voice weak but clear. Minjun was listening, his posture relaxed in a way Layla had never seen. He had brought a small, potted orchid, its petals a delicate, hopeful white. He was showing Amina how to mist its leaves. Layla stood in the doorway, unseen. She watched his large, formidable hands she knew could order death with a single gesture, gently cradle a spray bottle. He turned his head then, as if sensing her presence. His eyes met hers. There was no demand in them, no expectation. He simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and turned his attention back to her mother, who was smiling. That night, Layla only checked the locks once before going to bed. The peace was a fragile, thin sheet of ice over a deep, dark ocean. Layla started attending her classes again, moving through the campus like a phantom. She spoke to no one, her focus narrowed to her books and the clock, counting the minutes until she could retreat back to the silent safety of the tower. But the outside world had a long memory. The calls started a month after they moved. Blocked numbers, always. When she answered, there was only breathing on the other end, labored, angry breathing that she recognized in the marrow of her bones. Marcus. She would hang up, her hand shaking, the cold dread from the alley creeping back into the warm, climate-controlled air of the apartment. She didn't tell Minjun. It was her problem, a specter from a life he had plucked her from. To tell him would be to admit her complete dependence, to cede the last tiny island of self-reliance she clung to. Then, a package arrived at her old, empty apartment. The building supervisor, who knew her situation, called her. It was a small, shoebox-sized parcel addressed to her. Minjun's security retrieved it. They opened it in the sterile lobby of her new building, far from her and her mother. Inside was a single, dead bird, its neck broken. That night, Jay, Minjun's ever-present right hand, requested a meeting. He stood in her living room, his posture rigid. Chairman Kim is aware of the harassment. Layla's heart hammered against her ribs. He is displeased that you did not inform him. She wrapped her arms around herself. It's my mess. I didn't want to. Jay's expression remained impassive, but his voice softened almost imperceptibly. Your mess is his. That is the arrangement. The finality of his words chilled her. This was not a negotiation. That night, the call stopped. The silence was more unnerving than the breathing had been. A week later, she was leaving her last class of the day when she saw it. Across the university quad, leaning against a tree, was Marcus. He looked terrible, thinner, twitchy, with a desperate, hunted look in his eyes. He wasn't looking at her, but at the black town car parked at the curb, the car that waited for her every Tuesday and Thursday. He was watching her protection. He was studying it. He saw her looking, and a slow, venomous smile spread across his face. It was a promise. He wasn't just a ghost from her past anymore. He was a threat to her present, a direct challenge to the man who now owned her safety. She ran to the car, her fear a physical thing, a hand squeezing her lungs. She got in and locked the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. For the first time, she didn't want to handle it herself. For the first time, she needed Minjun. He came that evening. He didn't wait for an invitation, simply letting himself in with a key she hadn't known he possessed. He found her staring out the vast window, watching the city lights ignite as dusk settled. She had been tracing the patterns on the glass, a habit she developed to calm her racing thoughts. The city was a web of light and shadow, and she felt like a fly, caught and waiting. You saw him, Minjun stated. It wasn't a question. He knew. Of course, he knew. His information network was as sprawling and intricate as the city below them. She turned from the window, her fear finally giving way to a raw, desperate anger. What is this, Minjun? What kind of life have you given me? I'm a prisoner in a gilded cage, and the monster is still outside, staring through the bars. Her voice trembled, but she held his gaze, refusing to look away. You said you would handle it. He's still out there. He's not afraid of you. Minjun's face remained a mask of calm, but his eyes were dark, turbulent. He walked toward her, stopping just a few feet away. He is a fool, and fools who threaten what is mine are dealt with. What is yours? She shot back, the words laced with bitterness. Am I just another one of your possessions? Another porcelain vase to display in your collection? The accusation hung in the air between them, sharp and glittering. He didn't deny it. He simply looked at her, and the control in his expression finally fractured. A deep, profound weariness seeped into his features. When I was 17, he said, his voice low, stripped of its usual authority, my family was nothing. We were immigrants struggling. My younger sister, she was bright. She was everything. He paused, his gaze turning inward, to a memory he had clearly walled off for years. A man, a predator, saw her vulnerability. He hurt her. I was a boy. I could do nothing. I found her afterwards. I held her while she broke. I swore that day I would never be powerless again. I swore I would build walls so high that no one I cared for would ever feel that kind of fear. He finally looked at her again, and the raw pain in his eyes was so profound it stole her breath. I am not a good man, Layla. I have built an empire on the sins of others. But my walls are strong, and you are inside them now. I failed my sister. I will not fail you. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an excuse. It was a confession, a revelation of the wound that drove the man. He wasn't a monster. He was a boy who had never stopped trying to protect his sister's ghost. In that moment, the bars of her cage didn't vanish, but they changed shape. They were no longer a prison. They were a shield. The attack came on a Saturday night. Layla was in her mother's room, reading aloud from a book of poetry. Amina was sleeping, her breathing deep, and even for the first time in years. The orchid Minjun had brought sat on her bedside table, a new bud preparing to bloom. The quiet was shattered by a series of sharp, percussive bangs from the direction of the living room, followed by the splintering of wood. The front door. Layla's blood ran cold. She froze, the book slipping from her fingers. Amina's eyes fluttered open, wide with a familiar, primal fear. The nurse, a stoic woman named Mrs. Park, was instantly on her feet, her face grim. She moved to the bedroom door, locking it and pushing a heavy armchair in front of it. Stay away from the window, she ordered, her voice firm. Layla's mind raced. Minjun was out of the city, meeting with a business associate. Jay was with him. The guards in the hall. A new sound reached them, a guttural shout, followed by the sickening thud of a body hitting a wall. Gunshots. 3, fired in quick succession. Muffled, but unmistakable. This wasn't supposed to happen. Minjun's walls weren't supposed to be breached. Layla scrambled for her phone, her fingers fumbling, slick with sweat. She dialed Minjun's number. He answered on the first ring. What is it? His voice was sharp, all business. They're here, she whispered, her voice cracking. In the apartment. Marcus, she could hear shouting now, closer. The sound of breaking glass. Layla, listen to me. Minjun's voice was ice and steel through the phone, cutting through her panic. Are you in your mother's room? Is the door locked? Yes, good. Stay there. Stay on the line with me. Do not hang up. He was speaking to someone else in Korean, his words clipped and urgent. She could hear the roar of a powerful engine in the background. He was coming, but he was so far away. The handle on the bedroom door began to jiggle violently. Then, a heavy shoulder slammed against it. The wood groaned in protest. Layla. It was Marcus's voice, distorted with rage. I know you're in there. You can't hide from me behind his money. Another slam, and a crack appeared in the doorframe. Mrs. Park stood guard, her face pale but resolute. Amina was weeping silently in her bed. Layla huddled on the floor, phone pressed to her ear, listening to the sound of Minjun's car tearing through the city, a desperate prayer that he would not be too late. The door shuddered again, the lock beginning to give way. The door splintered, then burst inward, the armchair skidding across the polished floor. Marcus stood in the doorway, his eyes wild, a cheap handgun clutched in his fist. He was flanked by 2 other men, thugs who looked as desperate and strung out as he did. His crazed grin faltered as he took in the scene, the terrified women, the defiant nurse. His plan, whatever it was, seemed to dissolve in the face of the quiet, domestic reality. He had expected a confrontation, a negotiation, not a sick room. But his hesitation lasted only a moment, replaced by a renewed surge of entitled fury. There you are, he breathed, his eyes locking on Layla. He took a step into the room. Before he could take a second, a blur of motion came from the hallway behind him.
Jay.
He moved with a lethal grace, a phantom in a bespoke suit. He hadn't been with Minjun after all. He was the final wall. The two thugs were dispatched with brutal, silent efficiency, a precise strike to the throat of one, a disarming move that ended with the other's arm bent at an impossible angle. Marcus spun around, raising his gun, but Jay was already on him. The fight was over before it began. Jay's movements were a form of violent poetry, each one economical and devastating. The gun clattered to the floor. A sickening crunch echoed in the silent room as Jay slammed Marcus's head against the doorframe. Marcus collapsed in a heap, unconscious. Jay stood over him, breathing evenly, not a hair out of place. He straightened his tie, his gaze sweeping the room to assess the situation. He met Layla's wide, terrified eyes and gave a slight, formal bow of his head. Then Minjun was there. He stormed into the apartment, his face a thundercloud of controlled fury. He saw Layla, saw her mother, and the relief that washed over his features was so profound it was like watching a statue crack. He strode past Jay, past the broken door and the unconscious bodies, and went directly to Layla. He knelt before her, his hands hovering for a moment before he gently cupped her face. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. She shook her head, unable to speak. He closed his eyes for a second, a silent exhalation of a breath he seemed to have been holding for an eternity. He looked at Marcus's crumpled form with an expression of pure, cold loathing. "Get him out of my sight," he said to Jay, his voice dropping to a lethal calm. "Make sure I never have to think about him again," Jay nodded. "Yes, Chairman." The threat was neutralized, not with a bang, but with the quiet, chilling efficiency of a man for whom violence was simply another tool of management. The monster was gone, erased from her life as cleanly as a line of bad code. In the aftermath, a profound quiet descended upon the apartment. A specialized team arrived, cleaning up the debris and repairing the door with unnerving speed, erasing all physical evidence of the violation. Mrs. Park administered a mild sedative to Amina, whose frail system was overwhelmed by the terror. Soon, she was sleeping peacefully again, her face relaxed. Minjun dismissed everyone, leaving only himself and Layla in the silent living room. The city lights glittered outside the window, oblivious. Layla stood by the glass, her arms wrapped around herself, still trembling from the adrenaline. The sense of safety felt fragile, a temporary reprieve. Minjun came to stand beside her. He didn't touch her, just stood there, a solid, grounding presence in the chaos of her mind. "He's gone," he said softly. "He will never be a problem again." She knew what that meant. She knew the cold finality of his words. A part of her should have been horrified, but she wasn't. She was just relieved. The exhaustion was bone deep, a weariness that went beyond the physical. She turned to look at him, really look at him. She saw the tension still coiled in his shoulders, the faint sheen of sweat on his brow. He had been just as terrified as she was. "Thank you," she whispered. It felt like an inadequate word for what he had done. He had not just saved her life, he had given it back to her. He finally reached out, his hand gently taking hers. His touch was warm, firm, not possessive, but protective, reassuring. "Layla," he said, his voice low and serious. "What I told you about my sister, it was not to earn your pity. It was so you would understand. This place," he gestured around the luxurious apartment. "It is not a cage. It is a fortress. And the walls are for you. For your mother," he looked toward the closed door of Amina's room. "A home is not the furniture or the view. It is the people inside it who are safe." He turned his gaze back to her, and his eyes held an unfamiliar vulnerability. "I have spent my life building this kingdom of shadows, but it has been an empty one. It means nothing without," he trailed off, searching for the right word. She finished the sentence for him, her voice barely audible. "Without family," he nodded, a slow, solemn movement. His thumb stroked the back of her hand. "This is home now," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "If you will have it. With me," the fear was gone. In its place was something new, something quiet and resilient. It wasn't gratitude. It was a sense of belonging. She tightened her grip on his hand, a silent answer that he understood completely. 6 months later, the sterile glass tower was a memory. Their home was a house now, a sprawling, modern structure nestled in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, surrounded by a discreet but formidable stone wall. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The oppressive silence of the apartment had been replaced by the gentle hum of life. Layla was at the large kitchen island, a textbook open in front of her, a half-empty mug of tea steaming at her elbow. She was studying for her finals, but her mind was at peace. The constant, low-grade hum of anxiety that had been her companion for years had finally faded. She no longer checked the locks. She no longer flinched at sudden noises. She was healing. In the adjoining sunroom, Amina was tending to her garden. It had started with a single white orchid from in June and had since exploded into a lush, vibrant collection of plants. Her hands, once frail and trembling, were now steady as she repotted a fern. The rattle in her breath was gone, replaced by a quiet, contented sigh. The front door opened and Minjun walked in. He looked different here. The sharp, dangerous edges he wore like armor in the outside world seemed to soften the moment he stepped across the threshold. He shrugged off his suit jacket, loosened his tie, and the formidable Chairman Kim was replaced by just Minjun. His eyes found Layla's across the room, and he smiled. It was a genuine smile, one that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face. He walked over to her, leaning down to press a soft kiss to her temple. "How was your day?" he asked. "Quiet," she replied, leaning into his touch. "Yours?" "Loud," he said, but without any of the weariness it used to carry. He left her to her studies and went into the sunroom. Layla watched him, a warmth spreading through her chest. He knelt beside her mother's wheelchair, his large frame looking almost awkward next to the delicate plants. Amina handed him a small trowel, and he began to help her, listening intently as she explained the proper way to aerate the soil. Layla looked at his hands, the hands that had signed contracts and ended lives, moving with such impossible gentleness amongst the green leaves and dark earth. They were not the hands of a captor or a king. They were the hands of a husband, a son. They were the hands of a man who had built a fortress not of steel and concrete, but of safety and love. And inside its walls, they had all finally found home.